Hi, everybody. Welcome to our panel discussion on the topic of climate change. So you care about climate change. I am Philippe Lazaro. Thanks for joining. I'm the creative director at Plant with Purpose. For those of you who have listened to our podcast, Grassroots, you might recognize my voice from there as well as co-host. Joining me today are Cindy Chen and Bob Morikawa. So Cindy has been a shell engineer for 15 years. She serves on the board of Plant with Purpose, and she's also pursuing a master's in sustainability from the Harvard Extension. So she has a wealth of background knowledge on the topic of climate change. Bob is our technical director. Or he was our technical director. He's now our international programs director, evolving role. But Bob's been with Plant with Purpose for over 2 decades. He works closely with our international programs partners, really helping them implement a lot of the program work we do on the ground. Bob, Cindy, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having us.
And thanks, Philippe. And who are you?
Yeah, well, so I am the creative director for Plant with Purpose. I mostly focus on storytelling and communicating about what we do and why we do it and how it helps the communities we serve. So let's start by just introing the topic of climate change. You know, it's something you hear about on the news or in media a lot lately, probably a lot, especially over this past summer, as different parts of the continent have been hit and parts of the globe have been hit by some pretty extreme weather events. People have connected that to climate change. It's often talked about with a good sense of anxiety around how do we address this urgent issue of the Earth's temperature changing on average. So let's start there. What is climate change? And we know that carbon is related to it. A contributor is the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So yeah, could you just run through some of the basics so we can all start off on the same page?
Thanks, Philippe. Yeah, that's a great question. So we thought we'd start off talking about the basics of carbon. So carbon is one of the building blocks of life on Earth, and all living things are made of carbon. So we are made of carbon, plants and animals are made of carbon. And yeah, like, so when we're living, we have solid carbon in us. And then a lot of times, you know, when plants and things and animals die, we can decompose, and that can release more CO2 or methane into the atmosphere, and that is atmospheric carbon. Also, when plants and animals die and decompose, they could also be buried deep underneath the Earth's surface, and that could become, oil or coal or natural gas. So that's also made up of carbon. And then, as we breathe and as we absorb oxygen and we release CO2. And then when plants respirate, they absorb CO2 and they release more oxygen. And so those are some of the carbon cycles that are going on. In terms of changes to the carbon cycle, when we burn things, that also releases CO2 into the atmosphere. And so if we're burning, firewood, that releases CO2. If we burn coal or natural gas or things like that, that also releases CO2 into the atmosphere. Also, if we're, changing the land, so we're cutting down a bunch of trees to make farmland, that releases more CO2 into the atmosphere. And so as, there are, as more and more humans have been living on Earth, there have been needs for energy and more farmland and things like that. And so that has caused more concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so when you have a higher concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, that allows the atmosphere to be able to absorb more thermal energy from the sun. So it's kind of like if you're putting on another layer, like a jacket, it allows you to stay warmer. And so that is what's causing the global temperature to be just a little bit higher, is because we have a slightly higher concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Obviously, you also, like some of that CO2 does get dissolved into the ocean and things like that. And so you hear of ocean acidification. That's because the CO2 in the atmosphere is going into the ocean, becoming carbonic acid. But, all in all, like that's what's causing the higher global temperature.
And that
Uh,
image of, putting on an extra layer, that's sometimes what we hear about as the greenhouse effect, correct?
that's right. Yeah, that's the greenhouse effect.
Yeah, I think if I can just add, one of the interesting things to me is that some amount of CO2 is required in the atmosphere. If there was no CO2, the surface of the planet would be very cold. It's a lot like adding salt to a recipe. There's a certain
Mhm.
amount you need, and it doesn't take very long for you to accidentally put in too much and ruin the whole recipe, right? We've all done that. At
Absolutely.
least maybe you two haven't done it, but I've definitely done that. And CO2 is kind of the same thing, except that, yeah, we can't claw it back once it's in the air.
Yeah, seeing the
Yeah,
end of
absolutely.
a cycle too makes me think of it being a bit like juggling, and suddenly when you have
Mm.
uneven weight or spending too much time in one part of the cycle, yeah, it throws the whole thing off balance. So, and this
Mhm.
results in a lot of different incidents in different parts of the world. It looks like. Do you want to run through some of this? So we've talked about the cause, but yeah, when this becomes visible, what does it look like?
Yeah, so when you have higher global temperatures on the Earth, the higher temperatures allow water to evaporate faster from the land. And so that causes things like more drought and more intense forest fires, right? Because the forests are drier. Higher global temperatures also allow the atmosphere to be able to hold more water. And so that leads to more instances of heavy precipitation and flooding. This picture on the upper middle, that's actually one of our projects in the Congo that had flooding in 2019. Or was it just last month, Bob? Also, when you have higher global temperatures, the oceans have more thermal energy, and that leads to more intense storms and more instances of intense storms. So, Hurricane Superstorm Sandy happened on the East Coast a few years back, and my house was flooded in Hurricane Harvey in Houston a few years ago as well. And then also sometimes weather is just very weird because we have this global thermal system. And so when we have global temperature rise, that causes the systems to change. It causes the winds and the jet streams to change, causing very different weather patterns than we're used to. And so in some places you might have things that are colder than normal. And that's because the weather patterns are changing because of this, the system changing overall.
So is
Mhm.
this a reason why a term like climate change might be a little bit more all-encompassing versus global warming? I noticed there was kind of a shift between what the most popular term several years ago, and that seems to explain why.
Exactly. Yeah. Because when we say global warming, then when you have those changes in the system causing some places to be colder, uh, yeah, like it's confusing to people. So even though you do have global warming, like on a whole, like some places might be colder, while a majority of places are warmer.
Prior to this event, we reached out to a lot of you, a lot of folks who are listening, to submit any questions you had about climate change and about this topic. And so we'll be going through a few of them as we go through our presentation. We've got one that to start off with right away. And it's so we talked about how climate just impacts different parts of the globe and its effect on weather and how that causes disasters and things. I'm curious, how much education do about climate impact do the farmers that plant with purpose receive?
Yeah, it's a great question, Philippe. And I'd say in some sense, we certainly do provide education on climate and climate change and the environment and environmental degradation in general. But I'd say one thing even before saying that is that the farmers we work with, and I've talked to hundreds, probably hundreds of, maybe thousands of farmers, but hundreds anyway, of farmers amongst those we work with who really don't need any more awareness about climate change. They're already facing, so this is an event that happened in Thailand about 3 weeks ago now, 4 weeks ago, an extreme flooding event, which is really not sort of typical for this year or this time. And in other parts of our programs, we're seeing extreme drought and all kinds of unpredictabilities are happening that farmers have not faced in the past. And, farmers will tell me about how it's hard to know when to, before there were certain signs and certain things you could do in the spring or at the planting season and get ready to plant. And now those signs and those cues are not there anymore. So it makes it really hard to predict how to farm, when to plant, when to harvest. And of course, a farmer really only has one shot at planting a field every year. And if he or she blows it because, the rains came too early or too late, or too much or too little, that's his or her ability to feed their family for that year is potentially wiped out. So that's part of it is, the climate is educating us in some ways. But on the other side of it, we do teach about how the different regenerative techniques or sustainable farming practices that we promote help to address these kinds of things, like tree planting can help to secure soil from erosion. Trees can help, the things that Cindy, sequestering carbon, soil management techniques that help to make the soil more resilient. All of these things are practices that we teach about and that farmers are eager to learn about, to be resilient in the face of the uncertainty that they're facing. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those in a few minutes. I wanted to also show this photograph here. This is taken in Congo in 2015. This is looking up, and you can see, that there are hundreds or thousands of acres of burned fields here. And Cindy referred to burning earlier on as something that happens that releases large amounts of carbon in the atmosphere. This is something that farmers traditionally have done as a way of preparing their land. And there are some good reasons to do this. More and more people, these things are happening at a larger and larger scale and on shorter and shorter time spans. So in the past, this practice might have actually been sustainable because farmers could burn a field and then plant for a few years and then move on. And then this plot in front of us would have a chance to recover. But now, farmers are finding themselves having to burn the same field over year after year after year. And then that soil starts to degrade pretty quickly. It's a problem that farmers, like I say, are aware of. They don't necessarily do this because they don't care. They do care. They want to be able to protect that plot of land for as long as they can so they can feed their family. They know once that soil is lost, they're in big trouble. So they want to learn about techniques and practices that can better manage the soil.
So it sounds like more often than not, when farmers do have to resort to this thing, it's actually a pretty painful decision.
If you're a farmer in this kind of scenario, you're probably already poor, and you're having to do things that you wish you didn't have to do in order to feed your families. And as you cut down trees, you're contributing to decreased soil quality and pollution and erosion and flooding and landslides and so on. And then that, of course, as you can imagine, it reduces your ability to feed your family. Many farmers that we work with are sort of increasingly forced into making bad decisions that not only affect the environment, but also affect their ability to survive.
And so here we can kind of see that captured in the cycle you have. I see selling charcoal is one of the big causes and effects of this deforestation, the poverty link. Can you explain a little bit about that? How does charcoal fit into this picture?
Charcoal is a way of, kind of converting the natural resources on your land, AKA trees, into a commodity. And that commodity has a good value in especially urban areas. People like to cook with charcoal. It's an efficient way to transport energy. But as you do that, and as you do that more and more, you're obviously going to be deforesting your land and then reducing the productivity of that land. So that's sort of in a general way how that fits in the equation. Plus, on the climate change side, it's also obviously releasing more carbon into the atmosphere. But getting back to the question of education, like I say, farmers already know that these things are happening, and many farmers have already made the connections between what they're doing and how the environment is degrading. And so they are eager for alternatives. And a lot of the things we teach are helping to reverse, what we call this vicious cycle into a victorious or a positive cycle where tree cover is increasing and people are decreasing the level of poverty in the areas where they live. And we'll get into that a bit more.
So one of the things you brought up was the land that people have access to being, so especially when it comes to burning fields and why that becomes a problem, people having to burn the same parts of land over and over rather than having the space and the access to move on. I'm really curious how that might connect to a question like the next one we got, which is about environmental racism. How salient is environmental racism for plant with purpose farmers now? To what extent do they view their circumstances as connected to any systematic environmental racism?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I don't think in any of our sort of training we address this directly, but it is a huge factor. I'd say environmental racism and classism, I'd say is the other term that I would include. So in a lot of the places where we work, that's the poor farmers, and there are rich farmers in most of the countries where we work. But the poor farmers are the ones that have been pushed up into the mountains, up into the sloping land, the land that is sort of most vulnerable if you convert it from forest land to agriculture. It's the most vulnerable to erosion and therefore degradation. But farmers that we work with, that's the option they've been given. They've been really forced into that situation, and they're very aware that the farmers downhill in the plains, the ones with the tractors and that are growing the sugar cane and all this sort of commercial products for export to the global market, have all these benefits that they simply don't have economically and environmentally. It's obviously much less devastating environmentally to farm a flat land than it is something on the side of the hill. I mean, we have farmers who can literally be injured by falling out of their fields. I actually watched a farmer once falling off the side of his field, and someone grabbed him by the hand, or he would have gone tumbling, way down, several hundred meters below, and probably hurt himself pretty badly, just because his field is so sloped. And that is directly related to the kinds of discrimination that the farmers that we work with have experienced historically and in the present.
Yeah, and if I can maybe just comment on a couple of the places I've had the chance to see, I think the lens and some of the familiar terms through which we might be used to discussing race they can fit into different contexts pretty differently, just based on what country you're in. We work with a lot of indigenous populations, particularly in Thailand and Mexico. In Southeast Asia, there's a lot of citizenship issues that affect the amounts of access people have to land, to being able to own land in a sense, or at least to manage land. And so that does play a big role. The other thing that and our team in Thailand does have, does factor that into the way they work with these communities. The other thing I'll probably mention, and it's kind of pointing to something much bigger that I don't know if we have the space to talk about, but it is certainly worth looking into, is just the fact that there are a lot of historical factors and historical contexts behind each of the countries we work in that kind of reveal a bit as to why they became the countries with the levels of poverty that they have, or the environmental damage. And so I want to at least mention that to do justice to that reality, while regretting the fact that it's almost too meaty to fully dive into. But yeah, that's good context.
Philippe, you're making me think of the example of Haiti. And Haiti was a colony of France and was one of the most productive colonies in the Caribbean for coffee, indigo, and sugar. And at one point, it was more productive than the 13 colonies of the United States, and it was generating this, probably the most significant source of income for the country of France. And this was at the same time, that France was sort of moving forward economically, and these ideas of the revolution and, equality, fraternity, and liberty were becoming, important ideas. And that was largely and ironically, being driven by this wealth that was being generated in this colony. And by the way, a lot of the ideas of the French Revolution were being discussed in coffee shops, and that coffee was being grown by slaves in Haiti. So the irony of that for many people is that that movement towards freedom was, in a sense, being driven by a slave-based economy. So That's just one example. And
Yeah.
Philippe, you're right. We could cite examples like that for every place we work.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bob. You've spent a lot of time in Haiti and know that country fairly well. So I'm glad you were able to speak into that. So you touched on this earlier, but farmers, as much as they're badly affected by climate change and have to deal with a lot of the impact, they also can play a significant role in addressing it and in being part of the solution. And so it looks like mitigation and adaptation are two of the big ways. One of you be able to sort of, explain what these two terms mean and kind of how they're different or how they might overlap in some ways?
Yeah, so when we talked about climate change earlier, we talked about one of the causes of climate change, which include the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And then we also talked about some of the effects of climate change, which are, all of these unpredictable weather scenarios that we have. And so when we deal with climate change, we deal with, there are two buckets that we deal with them in. And when we're trying to, one bucket is to mitigate it, meaning to address the CO2 in the atmosphere part. And so we're trying to reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere so that we reduce the amount of climate change. And that's mitigation. And then the second part is to deal with the effects of it. So to deal with all of those, the fires and the storms and the droughts. And that is a bucket called adaptation. That's how we adapt to climate change. So Bob, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how farmers do those two things.
I mean, I think you did a great job, and there's a couple of slides coming up here where we're going to talk specifically about some more examples of both of those. But again, we have a curriculum that is something that we developed as a global family. We're 8 countries plus the US is 9. And we worked really hard together to share all of our ideas from the different places in the world where we work and come up with a series of themes and techniques that can help farmers to better feed their families, but also to do these two things. And in most cases, a lot of the techniques that we're promoting and that farmers are practicing, such as tree plant, soil conservation that you see here, are accomplishing both of those things at the same time. Ideally, you're sort of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak. And like I say, we'll talk a little bit more about a couple specific examples here in a few minutes.
So mitigation and adaptation, those two things do not have to be mutually exclusive. There are actions that fall into both categories.
Yeah, absolutely. So we decided to just do some brainstorming on what types of things are mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation, obviously renewable energy, and instead of burning coal to produce energy, that's mitigation. Preventing deforestation, producing carbon credits, composting, those things are mitigation to reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And then on adaptation, we have, things that don't necessarily reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, but still help us adapt. So pandemic training, emergency procedures, heat and drought tolerant plants and things like that. And then you have the middle that's both. So planting trees, right? That terracing, rainwater collection. And I love the VSLA portion too, because being able to save money really helps people be able to reduce the amount of deforestation that happens and stuff like that. But also you have like a cushion, right? That you can use to adapt when, bad weather does happen.
So in like Bob's earlier example, then there's no longer as much of a demand to go out and sell off some of your charcoal, as it were, because if you're more financially stable and secure.
Exactly. Like, and the VSLAs, I think, prevent a lot of deforestation and things like that. And then, it's a great system that makes everything more robust.
Can I ask you about one of the items on here that I find interesting? And I know that the answer is potentially vast, but if you could maybe just like scratch it a little bit, the pandemic training. As a means of adaptation to climate change, what's the link there?
Right. Okay. So as global temperatures rise, that actually makes the Earth more habitable for bacteria and viruses. And so pandemics are actually more likely to happen when you have higher global temperatures. And so we have a pandemic right now, and we want to try to reduce the effects of the pandemic. And so, when you're doing videos on hand washing and, like Plant with Purpose has done those trainings and has gone to the community, local staff have gone to the communities to teach them how to wear masks and wash hands and, social distance. And that is a form of adaptation to help people deal with the pandemic. But obviously it doesn't prevent the amount of CO2 or reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, so it's not considered mitigation.
Got it. So yeah, as climate change makes the likelihood of pandemics of different sorts on the increase, an adaptation would have to be learning how to cope with that through intensified hand washing and all those other precautions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, here's a question we've got, and I know both of you are really big into data, and so what does data tell us about the efficacy of Plant with Purpose tree planting on climate in areas where Plant with Purpose has been the most active in reforestation?
We do quite a bit of tracking of how many trees are planted and what kinds of trees that farmers plant and the different kinds of ways that trees are applied as techniques. And tree planting is not a monolith. There's many different strategies that people can use to plant trees. And so we try and collect data on all of this and understand the link between the training that we do and the behavior changes that farmers are involved in, and how that impacts the areas where we work. In fact, we even look at satellite data or remote sensing data, for those more familiar, and look at an index called NDVI, which is a vegetation index based on satellite data that helps us understand how much increase there is in vegetation, increase or decrease. But it turns out in almost all the areas where we're working, there is a measurable increase in vegetative cover relative to places where we're not working. So that's really exciting. And of course, we also have farmers telling us all the time in more narrative ways, sharing stories of how the trees on their farms are helping them to cope with changes in the climate and also to feed their families. Mm-hmm. So this is an example, a photograph of a farmer who is planting trees. And, I think it's worth pointing out that, amongst the tens of thousands of farmers that we work with around the world and the millions of trees that we plant, none of them are planted by Philippe and Cindy and myself, and very few of them are planted by our staff, even in the countries where we work. The majority of the trees that we plant are parts of the savings groups that, Philippe and Cindy referred to, and they are motivated because of their awareness of the things that are going on to plant trees on their own farms. They plan their own tree nurseries and develop them. They collect their own seed. They grow their own seedlings, and then they go out, plant trees like this on their farms to help diversify the products that they grow and to preserve and improve their soil. A tree like this that she's planting, those leaves, as the tree grows, those leaves will fall to the ground and add nutrients to the soil. Many of the trees that we promote are very high in nutrients that are good for the soil, and in fact can help a farm perform without any addition or very little addition of chemical fertilizers. And that's something that trees and other kinds of plants can provide for very low cost, and also in a way that's environmentally friendly. So these are some of the things that are happening and that farmers tell us about, and we see increases in yields as a result, and therefore farmers having higher incomes as a result, and able to save money.
So it seems like there's a lot of individual benefits that would incentivize farmers to plant more trees. It's good for their soil. It helps them grow more food, and a lot of them do see the financial benefits at like an individual family sort of level. And then it's good for the broader community and ecosystem as well, because it just supports the biodiversity and the health of the surrounding environment.
And those two things actually mesh for the farmers, because there's a story that of a farmer I met many years ago, and this is repeated over and over, where he had done some soil conservation on his farm, but none of his neighbors uphill had. And so there was a big rainstorm, and the water came rushing down the hillside and wiped out all the good work he had done. He was so discouraged by that, all his hard work, all this hope he had wiped out because his neighbors hadn't done the same. And it obviously was discouraging for me too, working with farmers in a broader way and at a community level, so that the work that this farmer is doing on her own is multiplied and it meshes in a way that makes it better for everyone.
We got a really good question about the types of trees that are being planted in our programs. Somebody wanted to know, I would be very interested to know what tree species you are typically having the shareholder farmers you work with plant. Does it depend on the region? Are you mainly focused on rapid growth trees with the greatest carbon sequestration, nitrogen fixing trees for the soil? Do you guys have any practices that you teach about green charcoal production? And then compliments, I'm a huge fan of your work. Keep it up. I love the discussion and effort to create an important conversation.
We promote all kinds of different trees, both native and non-native, both fast growing and slow growing. Some trees are meant to produce, as much wood as possible in a short period of time. Others are meant specifically for firewood, which is a completely different objective from trees for timber. Many of them are also nitrogen fixing and also producing other nutrients that help benefit the soil. We aren't doing anything yet anyway with green charcoal production. That's certainly something to look into. But I think the bottom line here, when we're talking about tree species, again, as I said, our staff are doing very little tree planting, and farmers are really doing all the tree planting. And farmers are also the ones making the decisions about their farms and their communities. As I mentioned before, these savings groups get together and start their own tree nurseries. They're the ones that are prioritizing what they want to plant and where they want to plant it. So that's a really important element of the work we do, that it's really very bottom up rather than top down.
What factors might influence what types of trees a farmer decides to go with on their land?
Yeah, I would say the first one, for better or for worse, is economic. Farmers, most of the folks we work with are very much on the edge economically and are living from season to season. So they're not going to plant a tree unless they know they're going to get an economic benefit from that. So that's probably the number one factor. But then they also do think about, for example, when they plant around water sources, and the farmers we work with recognize the importance of water. Obviously, they try to select species that are water friendly. So that's another factor to consider. And most farmers know very well the species that play well with around springs and rivers and riparian zones and so on.
What does water friendly mean?
So that there are some species that will demand a lot of water when they're growing. And so it's actually, sometimes folks like us try to promote this idea, if you plant more trees, there's automatically going to be more water and the springs and rivers are going to start flowing again. And that can be true, but it can also not be true. It's also possible to plant a bunch of trees and have those trees completely suck the land dry of moisture. So it very much depends on the types of species and where you plant them and how you manage them.
As farmers are making the journey out of poverty, that each step further and further away from it opens up a new window of choices. So even though the long-term most beneficial tree species might not seem like the thing someone wants to do right away, the closer they are to solving some of their economic problems, the more of those types of doors open up.
Absolutely. And, we talked a little bit earlier about the savings groups, and that's one of the reasons that we're such big believers. Maybe one might say savings groups, what does that have to do with the environment? But, going back to the example of Haiti, there's a saying amongst Haitian farmers, either this tree dies or I die, and that's a traditional thing that people think about. So, and savings groups allow people to get through those lean times and use those savings for those important priorities and keep that tree, So very much, there's a very strong connection between those savings groups and getting people out of that first sort of rung, Philippe, that you're talking about, where now they can have more options to think about other environmental options.
Yeah, when I went to the Dominican Republic, I guess it was last year now, it was really cool to see the progression because we went to a project that was, uh, where people had been working in Plant with Purpose for 2 years, and then another community where they had been working in Plant with Purpose for 5 years, and then 10 years. And you could just
Mm.
see the maturity of the 10-year program. And obviously, there was already a lot of hope in the 2-year program, but in the 10-year program, it really
Mm.
felt kind of like paradise. And the farmer was really thinking very, very long term and making really like sustainable, environmentally friendly decisions. And it was just really cool to be able to see that progression.
Another similar question: do the different countries that you work with require different methods of planting or management or climate change overcoming techniques due to their different climates and land formations? And if so, how do they differ?
The short answer is yes. And even within regions, within countries, and even on the same farm, you might have different things going on. So, for example, one of the things we teach is living barriers. And living barriers, you plant trees or some other species very close together to help reduce soil erosion and increase vegetative cover, and they also sequester carbon. But that might not be the appropriate technique for every corner of a farmer's field or for every location. There are some places where you might want to use a different type of barrier, like a rock barrier, for example. So it does vary a lot. I don't think we really have time to get into how it varies from place to place. I would invite the person who asked this question, when we're able to travel again, to please come and visit any one of our partners, and our staff in country will be happy to take you to places and show you some of the different strategies that farmers use.
Yeah, having seen a few of them, it's a diverse bunch of techniques.
Yeah, I've only been to 2 countries, and they were different. Like Mexico and Dominican Republic were very different, and I was surprised to see the differences. And it sounds like it's really designed to fit the community and to fit the location.
We spent a good chunk of time talking about trees, but with a little bit of the time we have left, we know that that's not the only way carbon is stored. Actually, soil does quite a bit of the heavy lifting too as well. So yeah, why don't we talk a little bit about soil and its potential?
So just to bring us back, we showed this photo a little bit earlier, and sort of the scale and kind of the immensity of dealing with these kinds of problems and the kinds of burning that are going on in this particular situation. This next picture that we're just about to look at is taken probably somewhere on this hillside or just off to the right or somewhere in this general area. Anyway, I can't promise you that it's exactly where I'm pointing the cursor, but somewhere up this hill. And so Rory, our project manager who you saw in the previous photo, is standing somewhere down this hillside here. And these farmers, this couple here, are using some techniques called biointensive agriculture, which you can see here. So first of all, right away, you can see that these beds are dug perpendicular to the slope. And so right away, when mounds are going to act as barriers to slow down and break the speed of the water. So right away, that's contributing to less soil erosion. These beds are also heavy in compost, so they're high in organic matter, and so they are able to absorb more moisture than just straight soil would be. So they're much more moisture laden and therefore resistant to drought in the case of if there is a shortage of rain. And then this mulching that's placed on top of these beds protects the soil from erosion. It also protects the moisture that's in those beds, so they have to be watered less, and they're again more drought resistant. And then as this mulch breaks down, it's adding nutrients to the soil. So all of these things are improving the quality of the soil. They're improving the productivity of this land. So this farming couple are able to produce more on a small space. And these types of techniques also happen to inject a lot of carbon into the soil. So, all of this land in this picture here, which is sort of contributing to carbon in the atmosphere, can be converted to this kind of scenario where it's actually becoming a bank, a carbon bank. And, with the millions of acres or hectares of land in the world, the potential for soil to be a significant contributor to reducing atmospheric carbon is really huge and kind of sort of unsung in a way. It's not really one of the solutions that people are starting to latch onto it more and talk about it more, but it hasn't really been something that's been as sort of popular as it could be. And farmers like this can really be, sort of climate heroes in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've talked a lot about trees, and trees have been a part of the climate solution for about 20 or so years. I think they started talking about it in the 90s. And soil carbon is a newer science, and there's still a lot of research in terms of how to quantify things. But I mean, we can see the difference between this soil and the soil of the land that was just burned, and it really does have such a potential to make a difference for climate, and in reducing the amount of atmospheric carbon, but also such a difference in just being a richer, more fertile ground to produce the types of food and resources that people need to survive and thrive.
It's great because trees and soil just kind of go hand in hand too. It's like trees help protect soil, and soil makes tree growth all the more lush. So these are two solutions that can very much be implemented in a coordinated manner. This next graph that you've pulled up, pretty interesting. Okay, so we have global greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector. And for people who are used to hearing about climate change discussed and things that talk about fuel or energy or things, those are definitely worth talking about. That the blue and purple slices are quite large. Plant with Purpose's field work is largely related to that orange slice. So that's also relevant to your interests as partners of Plant with Purpose. But and so that's where we've directed more of our conversation towards. And about a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions is quite significant. So let's talk about what some of these numbers mean.
So like you said, Philippe, this is just showing all of the different sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and so land actually does emit a lot of greenhouse gas, and land use change, but it also has the potential to absorb a lot, right? Because, we talked about the carbon cycle, and in a normal carbon cycle where we're not burning lots of things, the land and the soil and the plants are able to absorb a lot of CO2. And there was a study done in 2017. It's widely referenced now on natural climate solutions. And that means using things like forests and grasslands and wetlands and agriculture to absorb CO2. And this study found that there is the potential for nature, for these sorts of things, to be able to absorb about 30% of all of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so 30%, in some ways, maybe you feel like it's not that much, but when you think of all of the emissions that we have, 30% is actually a huge slice of the pie. And so if we can together as a society really promote these natural ways of absorbing CO2, it can really help get us to a better place for our climate situation.
So we've got two images here, side by side. This, I'm guessing, is the same piece of land. Where is this?
This is in the Dominican Republic, right on the border with Haiti. Okay. And the work that we've been doing here started in around 2005 or 6. And so this is a view, this is in Google Earth. So this is a view of this farmer's fields back before the project started, and then, in the more recent past. And both of these satellite images in Google Earth are taken about the same time of year. So it is more or less comparing apples to apples. And I think you can see pretty clearly, other than the cloud cover that's sort of confusing, but other than that, you can see pretty clearly the lack of vegetative, tree cover here, and the intense increase in it over this period of time. And this farmer has, adopted many of the techniques that we've been talking about, agroforestry, tree planting fruit trees for both market and for feeding his family. This particular picture happens to be about 20 20 hectares, which is about 50 acres, which is, sort of bigger than the typical farmer that we work with. The typical farmer we work with is more in the 2 to 5 acre range. But we see this kind of pattern over and over and over. So, I think when we talk about climate change, there's often a lot of kind of despair, I think, about how hopeless the situation seems. But we see farmers, hundreds, thousands of farmers doing exactly this kind of thing. And we can document this kind of change in different ways through the surveys that we collect and through satellite photos and the stories that we hear. And we know that this kind of real change, practical change is happening, and that farmers are able to do it. We just want to reach more farmers and have more farmers doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, those photos are amazing. They show such a difference. Bob, do you know if they were taken during the same time of year?
Yeah, they're approximately the same time of year. So it's more or less comparing a similar situation. Because that is an issue. There's often, I've seen before and after photos taken before by various organizations, and it's very tempting to take the before photo in kind of a dry time of year when everything's yellow and parched, and then take the after photo at, just after the best rains when everything's green and lush. But in this particular case, it is a fair comparison. And in the remote sensing analysis that we do, we're always careful to compare the same times of year to each other.
This is one of the things that I do find particularly encouraging, especially when so much of the conversation around climate gets anxiety building, and rightfully so in many cases, but just kind of seeing cases like these are a big indicator that healing and redemption are built into creation and into nature, and sometimes just a little bit of course correcting goes a really long way.
Yeah, it's one of the things where it makes me very hopeful. I mean, we're currently working with, I don't know if you know the number off the top of your head, Philippe, but it's somewhere more than 40,000 farm families around the world, probably closing on 45,000, which is a lot. And we see this kind of change on many, if not most of those farms. But, that hope is, it's not enough. We want to reach more folks and have, 40 million farmers doing this, not 40,000.
In terms of the current situation, earlier we talked about how nature has the potential to be a really big part of the solution, right, for climate change. It has the potential to absorb a lot of CO2. And right now, the case is that even though nature has such a big potential to be such a big part of the solution, it only receives 3% of the funding and is only 8% of the conversation. And so, to all of you who support Plant with Purpose, you are part of that 3% of the funding. And so thank you for being that. Yeah, that's awesome. And for those of you who are considering and want to really make an impact in a place that is underfunded, this is where it's at. It is it's only receiving 3% of the funding right now. And yeah, I mean, personally, this isn't I've been studying sustainability. This is a particular area that I'm really passionate about. And I just see so much promise, and I'm really excited about what Plant with Purpose is doing to fulfill some of that promise.
Yeah. We talked about how trees and soil, right? They're two solutions that go hand in hand, and then unpack that a bit. Environmental restoration and fighting poverty go hand in hand because that's a cycle, and even that contributes to broader justice issues. We talked about environmental racism and indigenous groups and everything. So it's kind of a very a way you can address a myriad of problems just by kind of looking at the roots and looking how these things are interconnected. Bob, Cindy, I really appreciate your time, both of you. Thank you so much for sharing from your experience and expertise. And yeah, for those of you who are interested in learning more about climate change and about some of the things Plant with Purpose is doing to address these issues, don't forget to visit plantwithpurpose.org. And I hope you stay tuned for more events from this virtual gathering. Thank you all. Take care.